So now Patrick Kroupa and Hattie Wells will talk a little bit about the third generation of underground treatment providers and how their story went in the Ibogaine world.
Yeah, chronologically, this guy right there would actually go next, but he has a lot to say, so he's going to wrap up the entire panel here. I actually first heard about Ibogaine when I was 14 years old, and I was hanging around on the Lower East Side, and it's once again from that guy right there, Dana. And it was a series of meetings called TAB meetings, which were like hacker meetings, and they had nothing to do with drugs or drug addiction per se. That was just the beginning of my experience with all of that. To compress everything down, I was a high-functioning addict from my late teens up until the age of 30. At 30, I had hit a very low bottom. There's, in addiction treatment, everyone will tell you there's a lot of stops on the elevator down. So for me, my final stop was, I had burnt through all the cash I made in .com with, an internet company called MindVox. I was couch surfing, shooting galleries at the time, and I turned 30 in the Tombs, which is not a fun jail in New York City, doing cold turkey. And at that point, I kind of realized I needed to make some changes, or the only thing in my future would be I would be 50 years old and standing in line on methadone maintenance somewhere on 125th. And Ibogaine worked for me. It was the only thing that I ever did. I had tried every other methodology for detoxing prior to experiencing it. And it was this amazing thing. The problem is it was extraordinarily difficult to obtain. I'm talking about the late 90s and early 2000s right now. And I had a lot of friends who were in need of this medication. And there were people who are, towards that same time period, I think Howard was charging about $35K in Panama for that hospital with the whole setup and the whole treatment. There was only a few people who went through it because it was like extremely expensive. And then St. Kitts, where I went through, was also very expensive. And it's like, I know people who were homeless, who were squatting somewhere, who were living in halfway. They're not ever going to afford this. So I became involved. We started something called the MindVox list, which was a mailing list that took over another mailing list that was kind of falling apart that had started 2.5 years earlier on Calyx. And it became sort of an underground railroad. And I became a high priest in this religion called Sacrament of Transition. And the sacrament part was, of course, Ibogaine. And I started engaging in underground treatments. In the United States, it's always been very strange and different from many other parts of the world, which is why we're pushing for medicalization and working within existing regulatory frameworks, no matter how horrible and difficult that may be, because otherwise, just country by country, Ibogaine will get shut down as adverse events pile up. But in the U.S., it was always a Schedule I substance, and there's a large variety of individuals who have worked with it. And for me, it was just, okay, so I can help this person, and, fuck it, I will. And over the course of about 8 years of working with people, I treated somewhere between 100 to 120 individuals. And at the same time, I was employed by the lady who had detoxed me, Dr. Deborah Mash, at the University of Miami's Ibogaine Research Project. So I had a good understanding of safety, which amounts to you basically, to compress it all down, you need 1/3 to half of your liver still going. If you've got Hep C and it's extremely active and your viral load is high, don't take Ibogaine. You need to get an EKG. You need to know that your heart is okay. You need basic prerequisites, or instead of helping somebody, you can potentially kill them. It's very different than other entheogenic compounds. And really, even, in countries like where we're at right now, it's not against the law. But if you're working with it, have a heart monitor, because otherwise you're not going to know what's happening with the person you're treating. And have a defib. I mean, it's great to know CPR, and you should. Everybody who works with Ibogaine should know CPR. But the reality is, when you actually need it, do you have any idea how hard it is to fucking do that? And I'm big. If you're a small person and you're supposed to do CPR, you want a defib, and you don't want it in auto mode. You want to know how to use it. You want to help people, not harm them. And so in the course of beginning work with people, this was the very late 90s, early 2000s, I interacted a lot with Hattie Wells, and both of us shared information and data and on what we were doing working on treatment episodes. And if it's all right, I'm going to just kind of go back and forth a little. I'm going to pass the mic to Hattie. And maybe you could express, well, my background is I'm kind of crazy, and I had nothing to lose at the time. You were very brave. You started working with extraordinarily marginalized individuals in a period of time when you were very, very young. What brought you into all this?
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Well, I think primarily it was my interest in work with other psychedelics, and my own experience with addiction and seeing the fallout of heavy drug use among my friends and some close kind of family. And, I, unlike lots of other Ibogaine treatment providers, didn't find my salvation in the form of an Ibogaine pill, but actually in the form of a bitter-tasting brew from the Amazon. And I got into ayahuasca drinking, and to get myself out of an eating disorder, and what was followed by a heavy cocaine habit. And so I was kind of using a lot of drugs at the time, basically during my teens and early 20s. And I was using drugs for a variety of reasons, primarily, I think, for connection and to find some sort of meaning and sense of transcendence, but also for escapism, disconnecting, and numbing out. And luckily, I suppose, for me, I found psychedelics among that path. And I found ayahuasca, and it did really transform my life. And so I started working with it and setting up a group, running ayahuasca sessions in the UK. And then, just by chance, I think, somebody said to me, hey, do you want to organize a conference on Iboga? There's this South African ethnobotanist, Dan Lieberman, who wants to talk about his experiences in Gabon. And he'd been initiated with the Bwiti. So I said, yeah, great. So we organized a series of lectures. And then at those lectures, I met Nick Sandberg, who had set up ibogaine.co.uk at the time and was on a mission to spread the word about Ibogaine across the UK. And at that time, no one in England had really heard about it, and he asked me to work with him. So I ended up in a little office in Soho, on the end of the phone, talking to addicts and drug workers and handing out information, passing out brochures on the street sometimes, and basically trying to get the information out there. And that then resulted in us setting up the London Ibogaine Conference in 2001, which a lot of people here came to, and that's how I met a lot of people. And while I was on the phone, obviously, and talking about it, there was only so long I could go without trying it myself. And so I purchased some Ibogaine hydrochloride and took it and had a very profound experience, but now's not the time to go into a trip report. But it left me with a feeling of connection to my existence, something I'd been feeling really uncomfortable with throughout most of my life. And so I felt compelled then to share this experience with people that needed it. And I obviously, like I said, I had a lot of friends that were, drug addicts, and I'd been at the bedside of lots of overdoses, some surviving, some not. I'd seen a lot of psychotic breaks, and so I just started doing it. There wasn't anyone else in the UK providing treatments at the time, And I happened to be living in a really beautiful place in West Sussex called Brownhill Farm. And it used to be a recording studio, and it had a perfect soundproofed outbuilding that was ideal for Ibogaine treatments. So that's really how it began. Do you want me to pass back to you now? Do you want to jump in?
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. Working with Ibogaine, I mean, for me, it's been a collision of many different worlds because, I mean, at this point, I'm a consultant for Clear Sky Ibogaine, which is very high-end, medically based, clinically managed. It's a medical procedure, and it's in Cancun, Mexico, where it's legal and it's a licensed medical facility. It's actually licensed as a hospital. And, you know, St. Kitts, I was, you know, working for Dr. Deborah Mash at the same time, but it's just like there were all these people who needed help, and there's just no way in hell they're ever going to get it by, you know, telling someone, you know, what are you going to do, go rob a bank so you can go get Ibogaine treatment? I mean, it just wasn't tenable. And honestly, if I look back at it in retrospect, there's a lot of different factors. I mean, a big one was just wanting to help people, and a big one was just I missed the rush of the underground, of being part of the whole culture of being a junkie. And this brought me right back into the middle of all that. And it's basically was having a magic wand that you could just wave across people and make this disease or sickness or medical condition lift off them. The problem is you're working with extraordinarily marginalized individuals. Their problem is not drug dependence, that's their solution. Their problem is their entire lives. So if you reboot them and you give them okay, there you go. All your sins have been washed away. You are beyond clean. You have been reset. You don't have any cravings. There's your life back. The problem is, what life? I mean, almost everybody has co-occurring medical disorders, comorbid conditions that they're self-medicating. They have trauma, they have pain, they have abuse, they have no marketable skills with which to make a living. In my experience, and I mean, I think, you know, we've gone back and forth with this a lot, the people who did the best long term, I would say that everybody, well, almost everybody who's ever was treated with Ibogaine, who I personally treated, had their life improve. Harm reduction did occur. People who continued using drugs used lesser amounts. People who were heavily strung out occasionally went back to chipping. But primarily, what's really important is what do you do after Ibogaine? And if you can't afford aftercare, if you can't afford this fantastic, perfect world where you go to a completely different environment, far away from all your problems, do what you can. Reach out to people. Get group support. Get individual support. You have to fill up this huge black hole which used to be occupied by drugs. And generally, people who did make that effort, who did work on themselves and did not treat it as just, you know, this thing that's going to cure them, they had positive long-term outcomes. There are a lot of people who did stay clean. There's a lot of people who did not, but ultimately that was their choice. And I'm going to pass it back to Hattie right now.
So in terms of that aftercare, so I ended up treating between the years of 2001 and I suppose 2008, although between 2005 and 2008 I was kind of petering out, I would say, and doing less and less treatments because I was diversifying my interest in plant medicine to things that weren't just psychedelics. But I treated about 75 to 80 people, and like Patrick said, you know, we had a lot of really good results, and a lot of people's lives were completely transformed. And in fact, I just met someone at a wedding last week who said, you know, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Ibogaine. So we can't deny that. But at the same time, there's this situation that I think most people who have worked in this will talk about, which is, you know, you can get people clean, and that's not really a problem, and that's what current addiction treatment tends to focus on either detoxification or maintenance programs, but they don't talk about, or they don't tend to want to look at what's underneath and how we deal with that. And I think what makes Ibogaine unique is that it peels back layers of the psyche, and it's like an emotional X-ray. But then you're left with, without the heroin, there's nowhere to run, and you're left with yourself. And there's that kind of time when you've got this awkward confrontation with self that you may have been running from years, and the Ibogaine gives you a window, anything from 7 to 10 days to 2 to 4 weeks, depending on who you talk about. But if you don't get something together in that time, and you don't have a comprehensive package and program, you're very likely to end up back with heroin in your arm again. So, and the problem that a lot of us underground providers have is that we couldn't provide that continuity of care. So people come in, they'll pay, they've only got limited funds in the first place, and then they go out the door, and a lot of times both the treatment provider and the customer feel a bit shortchanged without the adequate support to be able to translate the insights that they've received into action. And I think, unfortunately, the economics of it make it very difficult to create a comprehensive program that goes on, because taking people into a clinic and having them there for weeks, let's say, is expensive. And, and so it doesn't tend to happen. I think that microdosing and boosters and tune-ups, something Patrick and I wrote about in 2005, can be a great way to assist this. But obviously there's not been sufficient tests or trials to really monitor this or back it up with evidence. And possibly other psychedelics can also help, but because of the legal situation, that's very difficult, and because of the fact that we don't really understand the mechanisms by which these different drugs interact, people aren't really doing it. But this is something I wanted to say, was that if you are doing it, and you are providing aftercare in that form with people microdosing, I think it's really important that you collect data and that you start to share it, because there's a lot of missing data in this scene, and I think there's a real gap here. I was thinking about it, like, what could we do? Could we create some kind of Ibogaine app, that Ibogaine treatment providers could use and input their information, how they were treating people, how they were microdosing afterwards, what they were doing with the boosters. Is something funny going on with the microphone? No.
Maybe 3 more minutes.
Okay, I'm gonna wrap up. So, in short, I think there's a position out there to become the Jim Fadiman of the Ibogaine microdosing world. And do I pass back to Patrick or on to Dana? You want?
Just to wrap up with microdosing and doing smaller doses, typically in a clinical or a medical setting, you're going to be doing flood doses, and some people who are dosing individuals. Anyway, you don't need to hit people with 15 to 18 mg per kg of Ibogaine for it to have efficacy. If you happen to be in a position where you are even doing something insane and not recommended, like self-dosing, if you take very small doses of Ibogaine, take 30 mgs, 50 mgs, total, not per kg, not mgs per kg, total, that would be a terrible idea. But it would solve all your problems immediately because you'd be dead. But at 30 to 50 mgs total dose, you will discover that your drug dependence is decreasing. You can completely step out of your drug dependence just by microdosing, just by gradually introducing small amounts of Ibogaine into your daily regimen. And you will discover that you can step off and you can step out of your drug dependence. You don't need to do a flood, and you can do it over an extended period of time. So people who are not in a very healthy state, which describes a lot of addicts, microdosing is relatively safe. Unfortunately, we don't really have any clinical data on microdosing. There's been 0 published research on this topic to date. And as Hattie mentioned, it would be a tremendous asset to the entire Ibogaine community to start gathering this data and seeing what can be done. I think that's it for me. And now it's Dr. Beal.
Thank you, Hattie. Thank you, Patrick.